Ladies and gentlemen, let me paint a picture for you. Imagine a man standing in a crowded room, but he is alone. A man who walks through life without a hand to shake, without a shoulder to lean on, without a voice to remind him that he matters. A man with no friends. Now, before you judge him, before you dismiss him, ask yourself, how did he get here? Was he abandoned? Was he betrayed? Or did he push people away, thinking he could handle this life on his own? See, being alone is not always a choice, but sometimes it is a consequence. And consequences shape men. A man with no friends wakes up to silence. He fights his battles with no reinforcements. When he wins, there is no one to celebrate. When he loses, there is no one to console him. He carries the weight of the world on his back with no one to share the load. But let me tell you something, he learns. He learns the value of his own company. He learns to be his own motivator. He learns to listen to the whispers of his soul when no one else is there to speak. But here's the danger. No man was meant to walk this earth alone. Isolation can harden a man, turn him cold, make him forget the warmth of companionship. It can convince him that needing others is weakness, when in truth, it is strength. Because life is not meant to be survived alone. It is meant to be shared. And yet, the world does not pity the man with no friends. No one stops to ask if he's all right. No one questions why he walks alone. People assume he's fine, that he prefers solitude, that he is stronger this way. But what if he's not? What if behind the quiet, behind the distance, there is a man screaming for connection, but has forgotten how to ask for it? Imagine a man who never chose to be alone, but somehow finds himself in solitude. He walks through life without the laughter of friends echoing around him, without the comfort of a familiar voice checking in on him, without the presence of someone who truly knows him. He did not wake up one day and decide that loneliness would be his companion, but life has a way of making decisions for us when we are not paying attention. Loneliness is not always a choice. Sometimes it is a consequence. It is the result of moments stacking up over time, missed phone calls, unspoken words, silent cries for help that no one hears. Sometimes it comes from betrayal, from trusting the wrong people, from extending a hand only to have it slapped away. Other times it comes from the slow erosion of relationships, the gradual drift that pulls people apart without either side noticing until the distance is too great to cross. The man who finds himself alone may not even understand how he got there. Maybe he was too focused on his goals, working late nights, chasing success, believing that friends would always be there when he finally had time. But time has a cruel way of showing us what we took for granted. Maybe he was hurt before, and instead of risking that pain again, he built walls so high that no one could climb them. What he thought was protection became his prison. Then there are those who are different, the ones who never quite fit in. Maybe their minds work in ways that others do not understand. Maybe they love too deeply, care too much, or speak in ways that make people uncomfortable. Maybe they never learned the unspoken rules of friendship, never mastered the art of small talk, never found a place where they belonged. They did not ask for loneliness, but it found them anyway. And let's not forget the world we live in, a world that moves fast, where people connect through screens, but still feel disconnected in their hearts. A world where relationships are built on convenience, where loyalty is rare, where people leave as quickly as they enter. In such a world, it is easy to find yourself standing alone, wondering when the silence became your only companion. Loneliness teaches hard lessons. It forces a man to face himself, to sit in the quiet and confront the thoughts that he once drowned out with the noise of others. It makes him strong in ways he never expected, self-reliant, independent, unshaken by the absence of company. He learns to carry his own burdens, to fight his own battles, to motivate himself when there is no one else to do it. He becomes his own anchor, his own support, his own friend. But no man is born to walk alone. Loneliness, when it is not chosen, is a weight that grows heavier with time. It begins as an ache and turns into a void. It starts as a preference for solitude and becomes a habit that is hard to break. It teaches resilience, but it can also steal warmth. It can make a man forget what it feels like to be understood, to be cared for, to be seen. So when we talk about loneliness, let us not assume it is always a choice. Sometimes It is simply what remains when life has taken everything else away. A man with no friends wakes up every day to a world that expects him to carry his burdens alone. There is no one to call when things go wrong, no one to share good news with, no one to remind him that he is not walking through life unnoticed. Every challenge he faces, he must endure by himself. The weight of solitude is not just about physical isolation. It is about the absence of connection, the lack of a safety net when life becomes overwhelming. A man with no friends cannot rely on anyone else to lift him up when he falls. He must be his own source of strength, his own motivation, his own voice of encouragement. This kind of existence forces a person to become resilient in ways that others may never understand. When there is no one to depend on, self-reliance is not an option. It is a necessity. A man without friends learns to handle problems on his own, not because he wants to, but because he has no other choice. If he stumbles, he must pick himself up. If he is in pain, he must endure it alone. There is no comforting presence to remind him that things will get better, no reassuring words to ease his doubts. But in this forced solitude, he learns lessons that many never do. He learns that he is capable of more than he ever imagined. He discovers strength within himself that he never knew existed. He realizes that he can survive even when the odds are against him. And in time, he becomes someone who does not need validation, someone who does not wait for others to recognize his worth. He learns to be enough for himself. Yet, while he grows stronger, he also learns the cost of isolation. There are no shared memories, no late-night conversations, no laughter that fills the air. There is no one to push him forward when he hesitates, no one to remind him of his potential when he forgets. He must be both the dreamer and the believer, both the fighter and the healer, both the teacher and the student of his own journey. The world often sees a man without friends as someone who prefers to be alone, but they rarely consider what led him to this place. They do not see the disappointments that made him withdraw, the betrayals that taught him to keep his distance, the moments of rejection that convinced him it was better to stand alone than to risk being hurt again. His solitude is not just a personal choice. It is the result of a lifetime of experiences that shaped him into who he is. And yet, even as he learns to survive without companionship, there is an undeniable truth. Human beings are not meant to face life alone. A man can endure without friends, but he will always carry the weight of what he is missing. He can be strong, but he will always feel the absence of support. He can move forward, but the road will always feel longer without someone walking beside him. In learning to bear his burdens alone, he becomes self-sufficient, independent, and unbreakable. But he also learns what it means to fight battles in silence, to celebrate victories with no one to witness them, and to carry the kind of loneliness that only a man without friends truly understands. A man who has walked alone for too long begins to believe that he does not need anyone. He convinces himself that solitude is strength, that self-reliance is the only way forward, that leaning on others is a sign of weakness. He wakes up each day knowing that if he does not push himself, no one else will. If he does not fight his battles, no one will step in to defend him. If he does not find a way to survive, then he simply won't. There is power in self-reliance. A man who depends on no one cannot be betrayed, cannot be let down, cannot be left behind. He moves through life on his own terms, answers to no one, and carries his burdens without complaint. He becomes resilient, unshaken by the shifting tides of human relationships. He does not need validation, does not seek approval, does not wait for someone to rescue him when things go wrong. And yet, no one is truly built to walk alone. No matter how strong a man becomes, there are battles that are too heavy to fight alone, wounds too deep to heal without help, and moments too painful to endure in silence. A man can train himself to be unbreakable, but even the strongest walls crack under pressure. The weight of solitude does not show itself in the early years, but as time passes, it becomes clear that isolation is not freedom. It is a slow and silent form of suffering. The truth is, strength is not about standing alone. Strength is knowing when to let others in. It is knowing that asking for help does not make a man weak, it makes him wise. The greatest warriors do not fight alone. They fight alongside those they trust. The most successful men do not climb to the top in isolation. They build relationships that lift them higher. A man without friends may not realize what he is missing until life forces him to see it. He may not notice the emptiness until he has no one to turn to when the nights feel long and the weight of the world feels unbearable. He may not recognize the value of companionship until he is drowning in his own thoughts, with no one to pull him back to reality. He may not understand the power of having people in his corner until he faces a challenge too big to conquer alone. The world often celebrates independence, glorifies the lone wolf, praises the idea of a man who needs nothing and no one. But the reality is different. Even the strongest man has moments of weakness. Even the most disciplined mind has times of doubt. Even the most fearless heart has nights of loneliness. And in those moments, a man with no friends finds himself with nothing but his own thoughts, his own fears, and his own regrets. Life is not just about surviving. It is about sharing, growing, connecting. A man can build an empire alone, but what good is success with no one to celebrate it? A man can train himself to be unshakable, but what is the point of resilience if there is no one to lean on when it becomes too much? No man is meant to fight every battle by himself. Real strength is not in never needing others, it is in knowing when to let them in. A man who spends too much time alone begins to change in ways he does not always notice. At first, he tells himself that solitude is a choice, that he prefers the quiet, that he does not need anyone. He gets used to moving through life without the weight of expectations, without the complications that come with friendships, without the distractions of other people's problems. In the beginning, it feels like freedom, but over time that freedom turns into something else, something colder, something heavier, on the way to hell. At first he enjoys the silence, but soon that silence becomes a wall between him and the world. The laughter of others begins to sound distant. Conversations feel like noise, like something foreign, something unnecessary. He tells himself he is better off this way, stronger, more focused, unshaken by the emotions and attachments that make others weak. He convinces himself that needing people is a flaw, that relying on anyone else is a mistake. And in doing so, he hardens himself against the very thing that makes life meaningful: connection. The man who isolates himself does not become weak. He becomes resilient, self-sufficient, disciplined. He learns to trust no one but himself, to rely on his own strength, to face every challenge with no expectation of help. But there is a cost. When a man turns his heart into stone, he may protect himself from pain, but he also shuts himself off from warmth. He may avoid disappointment, but he also loses the chance for companionship. He may never be betrayed, but he will also never be truly understood. Over time, the absence of connection reshapes him. He forgets how to open up, how to share, how to trust. He forgets what it feels like to laugh with someone, to share a moment of joy, to be vulnerable without fear. He loses the ability to recognize genuine kindness, to accept help without suspicion, to believe that not everyone is out to take advantage of him. His independence, once a source of pride, begins to feel like a burden. The hardest part is that he does not always see the change happening. He does not wake up one day and realize that he has become cold. It happens slowly, like a fire that burns out one ember at a time. He stops reaching out, stops responding, stops making the effort to connect. And before he knows it, he is no longer just alone, he is lonely. But by then he has spent so long pretending he does not need anyone that he no longer knows how to ask for company. He has spent so long building walls that he has forgotten how to let people in. People on the outside may not notice. They may assume he is fine, that he prefers solitude, that he is simply a man who walks his own path. But deep down, he knows. He knows that there are moments when he wishes someone would check in on him, when he longs for a voice other than his own, when he wonders if anyone truly sees him. But he has trained himself to hide those feelings, to push them down, to tell himself that this is the life he chose. He may have gained strength, but he has also lost something in the process. He has lost the simple human experience of being cared for, of being understood, of knowing that he does not have to carry everything alone. And while the world may see him as strong, only he knows the weight of that strength. Only he knows the cost of a heart that has grown too cold. A man who walks alone often goes unnoticed. People see him, but they do not really see him. They pass by him in the street, exchange polite greetings, maybe even admire his independence, but they never stop to ask if he is okay. They assume that if he is silent, he must be content. If he does not reach out, he must not need anything. If he does not complain, he must not be struggling. The world does not check on the man with no friends because the world is busy. People are caught up in their own lives, their own problems, their own relationships. They assume that if someone truly needed help, they would ask for it. But what they fail to realize is that a man who has been alone for too long may not know how to ask. He may not believe that anyone would care. He may have spent years convincing himself that he does not need support, that he is better off handling everything on his own. And when someone convinces themselves of that for long enough, they stop reaching out. At first, the absence of concern does not bother him. He enjoys the quiet, the freedom of not having to explain himself to anyone. He tells himself that solitude is a blessing, that he is free from the disappointments that come with friendships, from the expectations that come with relationships. But over time, the silence grows louder. He begins to notice the empty spaces in his life, the unanswered calls, the lack of invitations, the birthdays that pass without a single message. He starts to wonder if anyone would even notice if he disappeared. The truth is, people assume too much. They assume that strength means someone does not need help. They assume that silence means someone has nothing to say. They assume that because a man does not ask for company, he prefers to be alone. But loneliness does not always announce itself. It does not always look like sadness or desperation. Sometimes it looks like a man who never asks for anything, a man who seems perfectly fine on the outside, but is slowly fading on the inside. Being perfectly fine on the outside, but is slowly fading on the inside. And because no one checks on him, he starts to believe that maybe he really doesn't matter. Maybe his presence or absence makes no difference. Maybe he could vanish and the world would keep turning just the same. That thought alone is enough to harden him even more. If no one asks, then he will stop expecting them to. If no one reaches out, then he will stop waiting. He will become exactly what the world assumes he is. Someone who does not need anyone, someone who walks through life untouched by connection. But even the strongest man has moments of doubt. Even the most independent man has nights where the silence is too loud. Even the most self-sufficient man has days when he wishes someone would notice the weight he is carrying. Yet, because no one ever has, he does not know how to show it. Instead, he buries those feelings deeper, puts on a stronger face, and continues forward as if it does not affect him. The world rarely checks on the man with no friends. It does not ask if he is okay, does not wonder what he is going through, does not stop to consider that maybe he is not alone by choice. And because of that, he learns to expect nothing. He learns that he must carry himself through every hardship, that he must be his own source of comfort, that he must be his own lifeline. And in doing so, he becomes what the world expects him to be, silent, but deep down he knows the truth. No one asks because no one sees, and no one sees because no one is looking. A man with no friends may tell himself that he is better off alone, but deep inside he feels the weight of his solitude. He watches the world from the outside, observing the way people laugh together, the way they lean on each other in difficult times, the way they share experiences that turn into lifelong memories. He sees it all, but he is not a part of it. He exists in the same world, but he walks a different path, one where there is no one to call when life becomes overwhelming, no one to celebrate his victories, no one to remind him that he is not invisible. At first, he may not feel the absence of friendship. Maybe he has always been independent, or maybe he convinced himself long ago that relying on people only leads to disappointment. He may have built walls around himself, believing they would protect him from pain, betrayal, or abandonment. But over time, those same walls that were meant to keep hurt out also keep warmth away. They create a barrier between him and the world, making it impossible for anyone to truly know him. As the years pass, the impact of his isolation becomes clearer. He faces challenges that others might have navigated with the help of friends, but he has no one to turn to for advice or encouragement. He learns to bear his burdens alone, to suppress his emotions, to push through difficult moments without a hand to hold or a voice to reassure him. He tells himself that this is strength, that this is what it means to be self-sufficient. But there is a difference between being strong and being alone, and he starts to realize that strength should not mean carrying everything in silence. Loneliness does not just affect the heart, it affects the mind. A man with no friends has no one to challenge his thoughts, no one to remind him of his worth, no one to pull him back when he starts to drift into the darkness of his own mind. When he is struggling, there is no one to say, "I see you, I hear you, you are not alone." And when those words are missing for too long, he begins to doubt if anyone would even care if he disappeared. The absence of friendship does not just steal joy, it steals perspective. A man who is always alone starts to see the world differently. He becomes more guarded, more skeptical, more distant. He stops expecting kindness, stops believing in loyalty, stops thinking that anyone could truly care. And when he stops believing in those things, he stops looking for them. He walks through life as a shadow of who he could have been, disconnected from the very experiences that make life rich and meaningful. But the hardest part is that loneliness does not always come with a warning. It creeps in slowly, settling in the empty spaces of his life, growing stronger with each passing year. He may not even realize how deeply it has affected him until one day he looks around and sees nothing but silence. No calls, no messages, no invitations. Just an endless quiet that reminds him of everything he has missed, of everything he has lost, of everything he convinced himself he did not need until he did. A man with no friends does not just live alone. He carries his loneliness with him everywhere he goes. It shapes his thoughts, his choices, his future. And though he may not show it, though he may wear his solitude like armor, there is a part of him that still longs for connection, for understanding, for the simple human experience of being seen. But when a man has spent too long in the shadows, stepping back into the light is not easy. And sometimes he wonders if anyone would even notice if he never did. A man with no friends may tell himself that he is fine on his own, that solitude is a choice, that he does not need anyone. But no matter how strong, independent, or self-sufficient he becomes, the absence of connection leaves a mark. He may carry his burdens alone, fight his battles in silence, and build his life without the support of others. But deep down, he knows that something is missing. Friendship is not just about company. It is about having people who remind you that you matter, who celebrate your victories and stand by you in your struggles. It is about knowing that when life feels heavy, you do not have to bear it alone. A man may survive without friends, but he will never truly thrive. Because life is not just about endurance, it is about connection, about love, about being seen. And in the end, no matter how much a man convinces,